In 2024, I read 102 books, and I can probably present a TED Talk that is like 10 hours long talking about what I liked about each book, what I disliked about each book, and the characters and everything, but I won't do that because that will take too long. Instead, I distilled each book down to one sentence that I think describes it the best. So this is me rating the 102 books that I read in 2024 with only one sentence. A whimsical and magical read I wish I could experience for the first time again. A sweet conclusion to the series, but a certain character gets a little bit too much screen time. Has great banter and good character chemistry, but lacks originality and is essentially a copy and paste of other books. An okay novella that doesn't necessarily add anything substantial to the storyline. An extremely disappointing read that mainly highlights bad writing and poor storytelling. Fast-paced and intriguing with interesting riddles and mystery elements. The mystery elements become less interesting that not even the love triangle can save it. A pretty forgettable story that becomes a little convoluted with the addition of new characters. A very unnecessary addition to the series that completely erases the character development set up in the original trilogy. Rushed but slow at times, with the same argument between the two main characters happening on almost every chapter. So disappointing. Couldn't connect to the characters, and the story just dragged on a little bit too much. A little slow to start, but definitely picks up in the last half with an incredible ending. Absolutely love the direction the series went, especially the side characters, and again, incredible ending. My favorite book in the series, with the "Who Did This to You" scene still repeating in a loop in my brain. Very cringy adult fantasy book that uses the pet names wife and husband a little too generously. Such a fun and funny read, and a really unique take on the vampires and werewolves romance dynamic. A very cute fake dating romance that will have you feeling so mushy. A whimsical read that reminds me of Bridge to Terabithia combined with a little bit of Narnia. Surprisingly terrible for how popular the book series is, with bad writing and even worse world building. Slightly better than the first book, which isn't saying much when the first book is absolutely terrible. Why drag on a love triangle when it's very apparent who she's going to choose? Probably the worst book I've ever read. Very confusing at first, but eventually everything clicked into place and I was hooked. The character development and world building is top tier and has quickly become one of my favorite YA fantasy series. A romance that combines magical realism but is ultimately unmemorable and just alright. Very cute read that incorporates science and data and genetics with really great character chemistry. An interesting and unusual book that doesn't really pick up until the ending, but made me very curious to keep reading. Short novella in Warner's point of view that I think adds an interesting perspective to the story. This is where the series gets very good and where the Aaron Warner hype is very real. Another novella, but I don't think it's very necessary or adds anything substantial to the series. Definitely worth the hype with how the characters and writing develop throughout the series. Unpopular opinion, but this is my favorite in the series because it adds so much more detail into their backstory with an insane ending. Novella in the perspective of probably one of my favorite characters in the series, Kenji Kishimoto. Again, love the inclusion of the backstory. It just makes the story feel more complete. I read this in a day. Another novella in the point of view of Kenji, but I don't think it adds anything to the story. I absolutely devoured the series within a week. I had a great time. The last novella in the Shatter Me series that wraps up everything so beautifully. One of the most beautiful romance books I've ever read about finding the right person at the absolutely wrong time that also weaves in grief in a very beautiful way. One of those books that everyone should read at least once in their life that is ultimately a think piece on totalitarianism, but is unsurprisingly still relevant to this day. There were some humorous moments in the second chance romance, but it wasn't very memorable. I was expecting Six of Crows but with vampires, but it was nothing like that. Everything fell flat. A solid debut from the screenwriter of Emily Henry's TV and film adaptations that deals with a lot of trauma. An interesting premise with a terrible execution. I really dislike the characters and the ending is so predictable. I absolutely love the way Abby Jimenez tells a story and the characters that she writes. A beautiful historical fiction about the importance of literature based on the pack horse librarians in Kentucky during the Depression era. One of my favorite Emily Henry books that has the perfect banter and tension. The prologue is so confusing, but the rest of the book is pretty good if you like complex world building. Just feels like one long setup for the last book in the trilogy. A good ending to the series that feels very much like Game of Thrones and Lord of the Rings combined together. A unique adult fantasy that combines Korean mythology and has a good ending but lacks a lot to make it a standout read. A summer camp rom-com that misses the mark completely. If Crazy Rich Asians was white and had a baby with Succession, it would be this book. My guilty pleasure read that is more emotional than other Ali Hazelwood books. Really well done. Has a great premise that includes dragons and a heist, but the pacing is extremely off and nothing makes it stand out. An extremely generic romance that is just okay. The book starts off strong and ends strong with great character development and world building in between. The romance is great, the politics are great, the fantasy elements are great. Oh, Jude and Carden, I will always love you forever. A fantasy with a unique magic system that's also kind of gothic and dark, a really great debut. It's worth reading the first book to get to this book because wow, I didn't know I needed it until I read it. Great nonfiction book about the history of HeLa cells and a reminder of the injustices in our medical system. I just did not enjoy this. It was very emotional and I just could not find myself rooting for any of the characters. Really fast-paced thriller with an interesting plot. Main characters a little insufferable at times, but I really enjoyed reading this. A really great continuation of the story that is so fast-paced with so many twists and turns. Unpopular opinion, but I love the direction that this series took with the way that Pip's character changed. A cozy romantasy that leaves a lot to be desired. I don't think I've ever hated a male main character more. How are you a grown man that can't work through your emotional baggage? The prettiest illustrations paired with the perfect short stories, all in Carden's perspective. It's definitely not as good as the Folk of the Air series, but it's great to be immersed again in the world. Honestly, the best part is that Jude and Carden make an appearance. A witchy romance that's a fun fall read. More of a holiday read than a fall read, gives off Hallmark vibes, nothing special. A beautiful story about found family with the perfect amount of witchy vibes and cozy sprinkled in. A great homage to Ellen Hilderbrand's Nantucket books, the quintessential beach read. This story is missing a lot to make it good. It was pretty boring. One of my favorite YA fantasy books that make my heart ache so badly. I love the way the characters are so complex and the layers of political intrigue throughout the series. I was not expecting the direction that the series took, but it worked out so beautifully. I have no notes. The perfect conclusion to the series that I will hold so dear to my heart and will always recommend. This held me off while I wait for Ali Hazelwood's new romance, Deep End. Overhyped and pretty boring at times. For how popular it is, I was expecting a lot more. It has an interesting and unique mystery element to the story, but it was just alright. Extremely enlightening nonfiction book, especially in the context of America's most recent election. Such a solid Abby Jimenez book that is both emotional and funny with such good chemistry. The world building felt a little bit messy and is just a little too romance heavy for my preference in fantasy books. Short and sweet holiday novella. A pretty heartwarming story about letting go and combines magical realism in a very beautiful way. A historical romance that reminds me of Bridgerton, but is nothing really special. Very different from the musical, but it's so interesting to read more about Oz and Elphaba's character. Cute holiday romance that has immaculate holiday vibes set on a Christmas tree farm, but just drags on a little bit because it's friends to lovers. STEM romance that fans of Ali Hazelwood would appreciate that is both steamy and fun. Such a gorgeous way to memorialize the iconic and record-breaking Eras Tour. Okay, we did it. Let me know if there are any books or series that you want more context of, that you want me to dive deeper into. I'm happy to do that. My goal for 2025 is 101 books, which hopefully I'll be able to surpass because I reached 102 for last year, but I'm not gonna hold myself too true to that and just gonna read what is fun and interesting. I know I'm gonna read some really great books and some really terrible books, so stay tuned to see which ones I like and didn't like and track my 2025 reads with me.